I'm going to do it in English just because it might be easier, because some in the audience are English speakers. So, Guilherme, thank you so much for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. And I'm going to be talking about this kind of poetic but also very opaque title of my talk, which is The Fallacy of Misplaced Concreteness. So, do you actually know when data was born? Any of you in the audience? How long ago, roughly? You've seen my slide. It was roughly just over 5,000 years ago, right? So, and it was born in ancient Sumer, right? Through these really interesting and very small clay tokens. And they were really used, I mean, you can see there's a variety of them with various graphical marks. And they were used for transactions of all sorts of things, you know, from goats to cows to metal tools and bracelets. It was a huge array of data points, right, if you can call it, as a means for economical transactions. Really, this is the birth of data as we know it today, right? Before that, there might have been some data in some instance, but we just don't know about it. And over time, these small clay tokens evolved into what is known as the first human alphabet, the Sumerian cuneiform, right, in a very sophisticated form of language that writes poetry and many different things. So, from the very early origins of data, we can see that data and quantification is tightly intertwined with business, right, with money. But it was really in the European High Middle Ages that this effort for quantifying nature really emerged. And it's all brilliantly documented in this amazing book that I really recommend you to buy. It's called The Measure of Reality by Professor Alfred Crosby. And here he describes how many scholars in the High Middle Ages were attempting to devise scales for measuring anything you can think of, right? Which ultimately led to the birth of the scientific revolution. But creating scales for nature was not easy, right? Most of the realms at that time were very qualitative, were very symbolical. You know, weather was either dry or hot, objects were either hard or soft. The time was really just barely indicated by church bells, right? So it was not a very sort of objective, quantifiable system. And while some scales you might think, well, you know, some scales were pretty obvious. You know, distance is one of them. You know, you just measure how many feet from here to there, right? That seems like a pretty obvious scale of measurement. But other scales were really hard, right? So how do you accurately measure things like temperature, speed, right, weight? How do you come up with a scale for that, right? So all of these scales had to be invented during this amazing period called the High Middle Ages. And in order to do that, numbers over time slowly became tools themselves, right? They became dissociated from any moral or emotional value. They had to be very, very objective. And that's how we receive numbers today, right? Not as some sort of symbolic or mystic value as they had before, but as tools themselves. So over time, this also meant that mathematics, as a means to measure reality, through formulas and equations, became comparable to God, to the divine. And this is actually a quote by Galileo himself, which I love, that says the following: with regard to those few mathematical propositions that the human intellect does understand, I believe its knowledge equals the divine in objective certainty. And I want you to pay attention to this sentence, objective certainty, because we're going to get back to it at the end of the talk. So the interesting question for schoolers back then, as they were creating all these new scales for, you know, temperature, speed, and so on, is how far can we go, right? How far can we go in terms of measurement and quantification? After all, if anything can be arbitrarily measured, things like temperature and speed, why not measure things like love or grace, right? These are all arbitrary scales, so why don't we just do that as well? Well, many scholars did try, in fact, to measure things like love and virtue, but they failed miserably. And this is actually what the title of my talk. This attempt, it's called the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, right? And it basically happens when an abstract belief or hypothetical construct is treated as if it were a concrete, real event or physical entity, right? And this is very much a common human bias that is shared by all of us, and certainly was shared by scholars in the High Middle Ages. And fast forward to today, right? Roughly 7 years after this attempt, I think still today we are very much driven by buzzwords like AI, big data, machine learning, and predictive analysis. We are going through and attempting the same fallacy, right? We are attempting, or at least we believe that it is possible, to map things like human performance, employee satisfaction, and customer happiness, right? That all of these things and many other abstract concepts can be measured and reduced to a concrete set of metrics. And here we are, creating dashboard after dashboard in an attempt to measure everything and anything that's unmeasurable, right? But is it always good, right? I love this slide. It's so good. But it is always good, right? Is it always positive and effective? Is it always clear and understandable what we actually are attempting to map and measure? Probably no, right? So let me walk you through what are some of the pitfalls of excessive measurement and data abundance. The first one that I love, and I face this all the time myself individually, is called analysis paralysis. I don't know if you heard about this term before, but analysis paralysis tells us that when it's basically the act of overanalyzing, right, or overthinking a situation to a point that a decision or action is never taken. You have such an abundance of options, of data points, that you actually become paralyzed by either fear of taking a chance or by the fear that you're not certain enough, right? This idea of objective certainty being a myth. Again, you are absolutely overwhelmed with data points, with options, with choices. And very much related to this analysis paralysis is one of my favorite principles. It's called X law. And this is a principle that we apply often in my own expertise, data visualization and UX design. It tells us that the time it takes to make a decision increases as the number of alternatives increases, right? All of us have been there constantly. Even the other day I was trying to buy a pillow, right? And nowadays you just don't buy a pillow. You have to research for weeks what is the right pillow, right? Consistency, there's like soft, semi-soft, hard, extra hard, semi-hard. Like, it's a myriad of options and different material types and so on. It's like, I just need a pillow, right? One that's comfortable enough. And it's the same thing. I used to live in New York, and especially in US supermarkets, where you go down an aisle and it's like, I just need mustard or ketchup. And all of a sudden you find an aisle like that. Like there's mustard with honey, chunky, no chunky, extra light, no sugar. I mean, seriously, like the number of options is absolutely incredible. But we think this is actually a good thing. We think that this is the pinnacle of human civilization, that this is actually a sign of freedom on its own. But in fact, we fail to realize that this abundance of choice and options is actually giving us a lot of anxiety and a lot of stress. And I love this quote by Danish philosopher Kierkegaard that says that the anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. And I think that's very much a quote that I love to attach to this specific notion of X law, right? Of this paradox of choice. And again, my background in UX design, we see this all the time. We see interfaces that are very poorly usable because they have simply too many options. It's confusing to a user, it's confusing to our customers to actually understand what the hell is going on. They take much more time to make any single decision to click on anything that they are meant to be clicking on. And when I was working at Google, we actually had this saying in our team that when everything is important, nothing is important, right? And this is a very critical idea underlying this notion of analysis paralysis and the paradox of choice. Now, if you really want to get into this topic, I couldn't recommend more this book, The Paradox of Choice. It's the same name as the principle, Why More is Less. It's a beautiful, beautiful book, and it goes through many different examples, very mundane, sort of like daily life examples on how this paradox actually is happening all around us. Now, I think the second pitfall of this excessive need for measurement is when we start treating a metric as a primary target. And this is also a big fallacy. This is also known as Goodhart's law. It tells us that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. And this is a really important thing as we continuously create these dashboards to measure all different metrics. So anytime you have things like sales, adoption, conversion, feature parity, profitability attached to and dependent on a raise, promotion, bonus, upgrade, you have a recipe for a lot of things to go wrong, right? What can go wrong, you may ask? You know, that seems pretty reasonable. Well, imagine that a doctor's performance is associated by how many success cases he or she is responsible for, right? You might think this is kind of like, you know, hilarious, you know, this never happens, right? It could never happen. But many roles and many professions today are measured by these arbitrary measures, absolutely every single day. In an area that I know so well, which is, you know, Silicon Valley and tech companies, many designers, engineers, product managers are evaluated, right? Their salary and bonus is dependent on the number of launches that they actually do, that they actually put out, right? And then you might ask, but did it actually land? Did it help humans? Did it help society, the environment, the business? Is it ethical? Who cares? It doesn't matter. The only thing that really matters is the metric, is the number of launches that were put out, right? This is the Goodhart's law in principle. And this is also what is known as ethical fading. And ethical fading happens when ethics are ignored or brushed aside in order to achieve a given metric, right? And we see this all the time. You just have to open a newspaper to see how ethical fading is happening all around us. A very famous case is, of course, the Volkswagen emission scandal of 2015, right? Also known as Dieselgate. I love that everything is like as a gate, Dieselgate now. It's called Dieselgate. And this is where, of course, all of you know that Volkswagen put a bunch of cheating devices for emissions testing, right? This was a huge catastrophe for the company. They spent billions in fines, not to mention, of course, the human harm that it caused and the environmental harm that it also caused. But it was a huge, huge issue. And this is actually a quote by the case study that analyzed what happened in the company. How can you explain this amount of ethical fading? Well, of these like competent, talented engineers, product managers attempted to do something that was clearly the wrong thing to do from an ethical point of view. And they found out that the culture in the company itself at that time was very pervasive, right? This was a culture where the demand and expectations of the company should be fulfilled regardless of how employees are able to perform the tasks, right? Again, what matters the most is the ultimate metric. Not whether or not this is ethical or good for the environment or for humans, whether or not the metric is being met. And of course, if you want to read more about how some of these metrics can go wrong, of course, there's a brilliant book. The name says it all, The Tyranny of Metrics. I love it. And of course, a very old book, but still very relevant still today, How to Lie with Statistics, which is always a good that everyone dealing with data should have on their bookshelf. And then finally, the last pitfall that I want to mention today is the one that we started off by mentioning this quote by Galileo, this idea, this myth, right? This elusive myth of objective certainty. And for a long time, reason and emotion were thought to be completely separate, right? You either are very objective, very pragmatic, or you're very emotional and driven by intuition. But what's funny enough is that David Brooks and Jonathan Haidt, in their respective books, The Social Animal and The Happiness Hypothesis, also great books, both of them mention extensively the work of someone we all know in the audience, especially Portuguese people, and of course not Portuguese people as well, the great work of Antonio Damasio, right? And Antonio Damasio, during his long career in research, he has really been proving that emotion and reason are not separate at all. In fact, you need emotion to have some sort of rational thought, right? So this idea of objective certainty is an absolute myth, right? So what he proves here is that, again, this idea that they are completely separate things is a lie. And he has proved this extensively through years of research in this space. And David Brooks says so well in this specific quote that emotion assigns value to things, and reason can only make choices on the basis of those evaluations. Without emotion, we wouldn't even have rationality, right? Without intuition, we wouldn't even have reason. But of course, this doesn't stop advocates of objective certainty still today, right? To strive for the most reliable decision-making process, right? One that is completely independent of feelings, of emotions, of instincts, right? And people that are very strong advocates of this myth of objective certainty tend to dislike ambiguity, error, intuition, gut feeling. My God, that's a very forbidden word in a culture like that. And as such, they tend to operate in a very risk-averse culture, right? They are afraid of taking chances, of taking risks. A great case of this, another one, is what's known as the 41 Shades of Blue. I don't know if you've heard about this case. This happened in Google roughly in 2009. And what happened is that Google back then was unsure what is the right shade of blue for us to have in links across many of our products. So we had a strong debate internally, and as with many things in that culture, they decided, let's data decide, right? So then they actually tested 41 different shades of blue, right? And then they finally, through different click-throughs, they find out that, you know, what is the preferred shade of blue that the people unconsciously are clicking on the most. Well, now, would you say that this is actually innovation, or this is actually excessive optimization, right? I would probably fall on the latter camp, right? I think this is absolutely pursuing this myth of objective certainty, and this is definitely a case of excessive optimization. And as designer and architect Phil Best tells this so well, true innovation requires the adoption of a belief system that sometimes must prevail in the face of other data metrics, right? There's a little bit of a gut feeling actually involved in true innovation. So this is just my very last slide, just a recap on some of the 3 pitfalls on this overabundance of data and this need for measuring all things, and also some of the books that are related to this. And I think my time is up, Di.r, and thank you so much for your time. This was great.